So Professor Chomsky has made major contributions in the field of linguistics, but that's not really why the social justice cooperative is rocking here. The New York Times claims he's the most important intellectual alive today, but they weren't referring to his linguistics career either, I don't think. It's his work in his parallel career that we have that is a little hope of understanding. And that in trying, and what that is trying to elucidate the mechanisms of oppression throughout the world. So the IMF and the World Bank are protected by two main things. One is that most of us don't really know that much about them, and the other is that the very complicated ways in which they manufacture poverty and suffering can't be addressed in a simple soundbite. But we have a bit of an antidote to both of those problems, and here he is.
First of all, can you hear me? Is the mic working? Yeah, okay. The topic that was announced is quite a mouthful. I won't waste time by repeating it. It's not a topic for a talk. It's a topic at least for a course. In fact, a team-taught course with plenty of classroom participation, which will probably be the most important part. I'm going to try to take a stab at some parts of it. There'll be plenty of loose ends. I hope they'll come up in discussion, try to leave time for that. The loose ends are in part for lack of time, in larger part for lack of knowledge and understanding on my part. And I'll just perhaps begin by saying that lack of understanding and knowledge ought to be borne in mind. It's quite widespread. It's very broadly acknowledged by leading figures in the field and others, and properly so. Right after the last Asian crisis, big surprise, contrary to predictions, one of the leading international economists, Harvard, Jeffrey Sachs, wrote an article about it in which he started by pointing out that the world economy is, as he put it, dimly understood, and then went on to elaborate on how it's dimly understood. The Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland, which is sort of, the central bank of central bankers, the most respectable institution around, they had a report about it in which they advised what they called humility. Nobody knows what's going on, and the least we can do is acknowledge it and approach the questions with humility. Just a couple of months ago, there was one of the economics journals had a series of interviews with Nobel Prize winners in economics. One of them was Robert Solow from here. He's the founder of modern growth theory, worked back in the 1950s. And he was asked, of course, what's been learned in the last 25 years, exciting years of economic research and expansion of the field and so on. What's been learned about growth? Central question. And his answer was, we have not learned a lot in the last quarter century beyond a lot of empirical data that we now have. He said there are factors that it's reasonable to think are associated with growth, like openness to trade, capital investment, various political and social arrangements, but we simply don't know whether they contribute to growth. And in fact, we don't even know whether the causal relation is in that direction. He says probably it's often the other way around. That is, growth, for whatever reason, which is not understood, leads to capital investment, openness to trade, and political and social arrangements. One leading economic historian, Swiss historian Paul Weyrauch, has a book about the industrial economies, the Western economies, Europe and the United States over the last couple of centuries. And he concludes that if you look at the data, they could give a strong argument that protectionism increases trade. How does protectionism lead to increased trade? Well, protectionism apparently leads to increased growth, and increased growth leads to increased trade. So you can make a case for that. Exactly the opposite of what everyone says. There's a sharp split between the historical data and the models, and that's pretty widely acknowledged among people who pay attention. The historical data is, for what it's worth, the last couple of centuries, is pretty consistent. Every industrial economy, every rich country, what are called the developed societies, starting from England and up to the newly industrializing countries of East Asia, and dramatically including the United States, which is a leader in this tendency, every single one of them has relied quite heavily on protectionism, massive state intervention, subsidies, targeting industrial development, and so on and so forth. The United States, radically so, in fact, right up until today. That's why we're here, in fact. MIT is part of the funnel by which public funds get transferred into private pockets. It's called research and development, mostly publicly subsidized. And that goes way back, and it's at the core of every dynamic part of the economy, and it's not just the United States, it's the whole of industrial history. It's striking to point out that the recent trade agreements, last 5 or 6 years, and the theories that lie behind them, what's sometimes called the Washington Consensus, the place is significant, intend and in fact succeed in eliminating the devices that have been used by the rich industrial countries, those I mentioned. That falls under a category called trade-related investment measures, TRIMs, which if you run through them simply cuts out one by one all the devices that have been used consistently by the rich countries. That goes all the way up to the East Asian miracles of the last years, and deprives the what are called the developing societies, many of them developing backwards, unfortunately. The poorer countries are deprived of these in the trade agreements, and the agreements themselves are agreements among the rich. Few rich and powerful countries create, primarily the United States, which has, of course, overwhelming influence, create the system and simply ram down everyone else's throat. They don't have much choice. They're not even brought into the deliberations. And they complain about it bitterly. The complaints are not reported much here, but they're certainly there. It's been going on for a long time, as the neglect has been going on for a long time. There was a pretty dramatic case just a couple of months ago in April. There was a high-level summit, the first summit at the level of heads of state, the most important in their history, of what used to be the non-aligned countries. It's called G77. They're the 77 countries that met back in the 60s to try to call for a new international economic order that would be concerned, would pay attention to the needs of the South, the poor countries. South's a metaphor, it can be anywhere, but the what's called the South, and the world outside of Europe and its former colonies like the United States. Their call for a new economic order was, of course, completely smashed, with long-term consequences of an unpredicted variety, including, incidentally, the current drug crisis. If there's time, I'll come back to that. But they just had another meeting. They've had many, but the highest level one ever was last April, at the level of heads of state. These countries account for about 80% of the world's population, so it's not a trivial part of the world. And they, among other things, they issued a long, detailed declaration describing what they thought was wrong with the international order and what they thought ought to be done about it, which was completely ignored, barely even mentioned in the North and the United States press, for example, a few disparaging words. But part of it was a sharp condemnation of the form that the international economic order has taken under the so-called agreements, which are essentially rammed down their throat, and have, among other aspects, what I just mentioned, eliminating systematically the kinds of devices that in fact have been used. Whatever the theoretical models say, they're the ones that in fact have been used for every rich society, beginning with England, the first industrial society, including the United States, Germany, France and Italy, later Japan, up to the East Asian countries. Turning to other acknowledgments of lack of understanding, because they're important to bear in mind, the Inter-American Development Bank, sort of like analog to the World Bank concerned with the Western Hemisphere, they just published a long, detailed study trying to figure out why the economic record in Latin America is so rotten. Should be good, lots of resources, heavily under the influence of the U.S. Treasury, U.S. government, everything should be going right, but the record is awful, has the worst inequality in the world, has the highest crime rates in the world, low growth rates. They've had, depending on the country, 15 or 20 years of what are called reforms, and nothing good has happened. And they ask why, and their conclusion is that it's not. They reject the conclusion of the Washington Consensus explicitly. That's the point of view that dominates the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, the U.S. Treasury, leading figures. It's called sometimes neoliberalism. Contrary to the Washington Consensus, they say you can't attribute this to interventionist policies, to what's called import substitution. In fact, during the period of import substitution, growth rates were considerably higher, including social development. So you can't attribute to that. And they argue that more than half the difference between Latin America and the rich countries is a reflection of the fact that they have weak states. They call it institutional lacks. What it amounts to is weak states. They can't control the rich. That's what it amounts to. And the governments don't provide public services, research, subsidies, integration of the economy, and so on and so forth. They also point out that they've suffered from a general problem of the South, namely agricultural development and health have suffered very seriously from what are called market policies. The way markets work is that those who have concentrated power dominate them, obviously. Markets don't produce what people need. They produce what rich people can buy, overwhelmingly. And market control has a big effect on that. You can see that, for example, in what's called the agricultural crisis in North America, the United States and Canada. There is an agricultural crisis, but if you look where it is, it's striking. The food chain begins with big energy corporations, to produce fertilizers and so on. And then the chain in the middle are farmers. At the end are the big retailers and distributors and so on. It turns out that the agricultural crisis in both the United States and Canada is located in the middle, in the farmers. The farmers who are producing the food. That's where the crisis is. At every other point, there's terrific profits. And that relates very closely to market control. At the outer edges of the chain, it's highly concentrated power. They determine how the markets are going to work. In the middle, it's people who are more or less thrown on the market, and they're suffering badly, even with huge subsidies. And the same relation holds in the international economy. And with regard to agriculture and health, the international the IADB, the Inter-American Development Bank, specifically points out that agricultural research and development are geared to the rich countries. That's been true in the United States for a long time. One of the reasons why the U.S. has very productive agriculture is national federal investments since the 19th century, which have ultimately, after the Second World War, had a big impact. That still goes on. But there's very little research and development in the kinds of agriculture that are used in the poor countries, South, say tropical agriculture. And that's just a direct reflection of who has power, and hence who controls markets to the extent that they function. The same is true in health, they point out. In fact, there's a well-known principle in the public health field called the 90-10 principle, which is that 90% of the research goes for 10% of the health problems. namely the 10% that the rich suffer from. And again, that's not a big surprise. That's the way you'd expect institutions to work, including markets to the limited extent that they function. Well, when you turn to finance, notice that all of this is, as they point out, is quite contrary to the Washington Consensus, the theory that says, let the markets decide and get the government out of the way. Exactly contrary. When you turn to the financial domain, the financial architecture and so on, which is of enormous significance today, it just dominates the international economy in the last couple of decades. Here it's total chaos. I mean, everyone concedes that there just is no theory at all. There are no models. There's an interesting book by Robert Blecker, an economist at American University, surveys, kind of semi-technical book, which surveys, but readable, in which he surveys the models that have been constructed in the last 10 or 15 years of huge financial flows to try to figure out what's going on. And, you get model after model. The ones that work best are what are called random walk models, flip a coin. And what he points out is that every couple of years they're all thrown out and you start with new ones because the past ones predicted completely wrongly. And this is again widely acknowledged. Harvard economist Danny Roderick recently wrote that it's a sad commentary on our understanding of what drives capital flows that every crisis spawns a new generation of economic models. And that's very rapid, especially in the last 10 or 15 years when markets have been extremely volatile. That's a reflection of the liberalization of capital markets in the early 70s, and again, it's exactly contrary to predictions by major economists. If you take a look at the IMF World Bank predictions, international financial institutions, they've made lots of predictions over the years, and the record is not very uplifting, to say the least. They are very good economists, thousands of economists, working hard on it all the time. And they make predictions. The predictions are given with great confidence, and they turn into policy prescriptions very quickly. So, for example, in 1997, the directors of both institutions published major studies. They were going to be very widely publicized and advertised, in which, this is more or less quotes, they strongly praised the remarkable economic performance and sound macroeconomic policies and the depth and liquidity of markets of Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and South Korea. And the Philippines is right behind. Just as these major books appeared, they all collapsed. The books were quickly withdrawn. Nobody heard much about them anymore. The IMF had also predicted with much confidence, assured people that private firms are certain to be careful about what they do, about costs and risks and so on, costs of borrowing. Well, it turned out that private borrowing was the source of the crisis. The earlier record is no more exciting. So through the 1970s, both institutions urged banks to lend massively to the poor countries and urged the poor countries to borrow as much as possible, and had kind of models which proved that this was going to be a wonderful thing to do. And that continued, right? In fact, the latest publication on the subject was in 1982, again, urging this policy. It appeared just a couple of weeks before Mexico defaulted on its debt, setting off an international crisis, which converted policy in a totally different direction towards what came to be called structural adjustment programs, which imposed very harsh austerity on the people of the South to pay off the debt, which was accumulated during the period when they were told that's exactly, not they, but their mostly dictatorial leaders were told what to do. Incidentally, the people who pay the debt are not the people who borrowed the money. The debt is to a large extent an ideological construction, not an economic fact. So take a look, say, at Latin America, export of capital, meaning rich people sending their money to banks in New York and London, was more or less on the order of the debt. The rich and the generals who we backed or instituted and so on, they borrowed the money, not the peasants. Anything to say about it. But the austerity programs are imposed on the peasants, not the rich. So it's not the people who borrowed the money who pay the debt. It's the poor who pay the debt. And in part, the debt is socialized to people like us, to the rich. One of the roles of the IMF is to provide what amounts to free risk insurance. If debts aren't repaid, it's not the problem of the lender. They got to be protected. After all, they're banks and rich folk and stuff like that. So the debt is socialized. The IMF takes it over, which means it's distributed to northern taxpayers. So you end up with a system. The IMF is being criticized right now on the streets of Prague as a major defender of capitalism. From another point of view, it's kind of the opposite. There's a capitalist principle that says that people who lend money take a risk. If it doesn't work, it's their problem. And people who borrow money have to pay it back. Like if you lend me money and I buy a Mercedes with it, and then you come and say you want your money back, I'm not supposed to be able to say, look, I don't feel like paying it, ask my neighbor, he'll pay it. And if you don't want to take the risk, you say, okay, my neighbor will do it. That's not the capitalist principle. If that principle were applied, it would wipe out most of the debt right away, but at the cost of harming rich people, and that's not the way things work. So a different principle works, and it's the one I described. And those that record of predictions and costs continues. Another more recent example is what are called the transition economies. The countries of Eastern Russia and the other countries of Eastern Europe after the Soviet tyranny collapsed around 1990, they moved to market systems. And again, there were very confident predictions. The World Bank stated very confidently, I'll quote, countries that liberalize rapidly and extensively turn around more quickly. The man who was later became the chief economist of the World Bank, Joseph Stiglitz, in a recent article, quoted this and pointed out that it was a reasonable prediction because he said economic theory was extremely clear in giving that prediction. The only trouble is it turned into a huge catastrophe. I mean, it was predicted that if these policies, then they were spelled out, but if these policy prescriptions were followed, that output was going to just soar. Everybody would become rich, like us folks. In fact, what happened is that output declined, plummeted. In fact, the economy probably collapsed by about 50% or something. Right now, about 75% of Russians are below the poverty line. It's a radical decline from before. A majority of children, it's estimated somewhere between 50 and 80%, have physical and mental defects. Workers' rights, which did exist, are totally gone. Capital flight from the newly liberalizing economy is greater than loans and investments, which doesn't harm the American economy. Most of it comes here. It's the worst depression in modern history, if not in all of history, outside of maybe a war, a plague, or something like that. And it's a demographic catastrophe. Millions of people have died, or to put it in a different way, have been killed by the so-called economic reforms, which again were offered with great confidence on the basis of, as Stiglitz put it, the best economic theory, which lay behind it. In some respects, if you move away from economics and look at the socio-political perspective, this doesn't look to me like much of a surprise. It has to do with the nature of the Cold War. That's a topic in itself, but in many respects, ever since 1917, when the Cold War began, it's had many of the properties of what's called a North-South conflict, like the U.S. war against Nicaragua and dozens of others, imperial conflicts. And the end result of these, typically, is that a country that tried to break out of the system gets smashed because it's weaker than the ones with the power. And when it gets smashed, it gets driven right back into the system, maybe poorer than it was before. So, for example, Nicaragua is now one of the second poorest after, maybe third after Haiti and Guatemala in the hemisphere, collapsed since the U.S. took it back over in 1990. And that's actually the same is true of Guatemala and Haiti. They're the countries that have it's a rather striking fact, which takes a little discipline to ignore, that the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere, the real super basket cases, are the ones that have had the most exposure to U.S. intervention, invasions, control of the economy, and so on and so forth. Maybe it's an accident. Maybe there's a connection. If you look at the record, I think you can tease out a connection. And what happened in Russia is not very different. 1917, whatever you think about the government, monstrous, brutal tyranny and so on, but whatever else it was, it pulled out of the international system and industrialized the country, carried out a kind of forced industrialization. Russia had been an extremely poor third world country. Third world's a metaphor. There's no third world in those days. What we call a third world country, it was deeply impoverished, falling more and more behind the West, kind of a colony of the West for the most part. It pulled out, did what it did, very fast growth rate, so on. It lost the war, like the weaker contestant always does, and it's returned right back to the South. So it looks like a catastrophe in comparison to what it was in 1989. But if you look at it in comparison to, say, Brazil, it doesn't look like such a catastrophe. In fact, it looks pretty much like Brazil. And it looks pretty much like other countries of the South that never did pull out. So from some points of view, it's a catastrophe, but from another point of view, this is not a matter of economics, no. It's not. It's simply the normal course of historical events with which we ought to be familiar. Europe and Africa, United States and Latin America, many other cases. Well, that's another prediction. One could go on. Let me stress that I'm not trying to criticize failure of prediction. I think that's to be expected. Because, as Sachs put it, the international economy is dimly understood. Nobody knows what's going on. So therefore, predictions are likely to be, low confidence. The problems are hard. It's poorly understood. The problem is not so much that the predictions fail, but the confidence with which they're presented. And then the policies that follow them from them are implemented and enforced with very little understanding of what's going on, and omission of a multitude of factors that surely enter, and reliance on models which may look pretty and have nice theorems and so on, but have very questionable relevance to real-world phenomena. They don't seem to have much to do with the history of development. Some few examples of when they're applied. So I think that should be the thing one should be critical of, not the failure of prediction. You get beyond simple systems like big molecules, and problem of prediction ability to predict goes down pretty fast. When you get to human affairs, it's kind of like zero. But but rather the confidence in the predictions and the force with which they're imposed, which with the principles are imposed, often, very radical experiments, which have disastrous effects quite often, as you might expect. You take a system you don't understand and hit it with a sledgehammer, it's likely to have harmful effects, even if you have a theory that says sledgehammer will be good for it. So it's not too surprising that the record of prediction is so poor. And there's a lesson here for critics of the policies, like a lot of us, and people in the streets in Prague and so on. The lesson is pretty simple. You got to be careful. You should be very confident. You should have little confidence in your criticisms either, because the system is very poorly understood. The lesson from that is not paralysis. On the contrary, human being got to act. You have to live and do things. But caution. It's worthwhile having caution. I'm going to omit that qualification in everything I say from now on, but keep it in mind. I'll sound a lot more confident than I am. Well, qualifications aside, what does the general picture look like about, say, what's called globalization, which has become a kind of a catchword in the last 10 or 15 years? Let's just use standard data, but more or less uncontroversial, not very good, but standard. Globalization, kind of in a neutral sense, refers to international economic integration, which can be measured in many different ways. However, in the period in which the term has become common coin, the last 10 or 15 years, it's also been associated with something else, which doesn't logically follow. It's not connected to economic integration. It's connected, but by decision, not by law. and that is a shift of power away from governments and towards what's called markets. But what markets means is concentrations of private power, concentrations of unaccountable private power. So major corporations, linked to one another, linked to powerful states and relying on them. The international financial institutions, money managers, U.S. Treasury, and so on. Those are basically unaccountable. U.S. Treasury sounds like a government, but if you look at it, it's a representative of the U.S. corporate sector, and there's been a shift, a notable shift, from governments to concentrations of private power, unaccountable private power. There's a name for that. It's called neoliberalism, or some other term, but that's property of contemporary globalization. Now, to the extent that governments are democratic, and they vary in that respect, but to the extent that they're democratic, this shift means a decline in democracy, decline in popular sovereignty, and the ability of people to make choices that affect their lives and so on. That's kind of necessary, and in fact, that's intended. That's a property of what are called the reforms. Incidentally, you should bear in mind that the term reform is a term of propaganda, not of description. So the term reform doesn't refer to a lot of changes that take place aren't called reforms. So, for example, the Sandinistas or Aristide in Haiti introduced economic and social changes, which were, in fact, highly praised by the World Bank and the IMF and the development agencies and so on, but those weren't called reforms. Those were bad things which had to be beaten back. They're not reforms. And they were beaten back, as such things tend to be. And the reason is they benefited the wrong people. Reforms are changes that benefit the right people. They're the ones that are called reforms. That's not the meaning of the word, but it's the operative meaning. If you take a look at the way it's used, it's essentially the way it's used. So I'll keep using it, but remembering what that means. So the reforms have the property that I mentioned. A central part of them is a shift from governments to unaccountable private power, masking under the name the market. The globalization in the neutral sense, meaning economic integration, that's gone through several different phases over the centuries. It's an old phenomenon. There's a conventional way of describing it, and I think it's fair enough. It describes it in three phases. One phase leading up to World War I, another one in the interwar period, and a third after World War II. And those three phases are quite different. The one after World War II itself breaks up into two periods. The first period is called the Bretton Woods period. That after the Second World War, the U.S. and Britain, which won the war, constructed an international economic order. That was the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, and that constructed by Keynes and Harry Dexter White in the United States primarily, and it had certain properties. I'll come back to them. That regime more or less held, not perfectly, but it more or less was in place up until the early 1970s. At that point, it was dismantled again by the U.S. and Britain, primarily the United States at that point, which was just overwhelmingly powerful. The United States initiative in Britain and other countries, and then you get a second phase of post-war globalization. So we have four phases, really: the pre-World War I, interwar, Bretton Woods period, and the more recent period. It's the more recent one since the 70s. It's usually called globalization. Well, these phases are quite different, and it's important to notice how. There is a sort of a conventional picture of this. You can read it for, say, this morning's Boston Globe, which I happened to take a look at they have an economics correspondent, Robert Samuelson, good economics correspondent. He gives the conventional picture. He says that by conventional I mean standard. Now, it's not what the data say. He says, look, globalization, meaning what's going on in the last couple of decades, has been fantastic, led to enormous growth, fairy tale economies, all this wonderful stuff, but it hasn't worked everywhere. So there are a lot of countries that have been left out, and that's what people are protesting about. Some of the poor countries have been left out. they haven't adopted the American system, the good system, sort of by definition. And why haven't they done that? And he brings up some currently fashionable theories. Maybe it has to do with their culture. Their culture is anti-capitalist, and so they can't absorb the message of the American system and so on. That's the standard picture. If you look at the facts, it's quite a different picture, and it's worth, I'm sure you've heard that thousands of times. Every time you open a newspaper or read a journal or listen to an article, somebody in the radio, that's approximately what they say. And so they sort of understand, but he's talking about the protesters. He says, yeah, we understand the protesters. It's true that some people have been left out of all these marvels like sub-Saharan Africa and so on, and we got to figure out why. Well, let's put the propaganda aside and look at what people more or less understand. How do we measure international economic integration? Thinking of it neutrally. Well, one way to measure it is in terms of people. How do people move around the world? Migration flows, in other words. By that measure, the highest period of globalization was the first phase prior to World War I. That's when populations were really flowing fast. The reason was Europe was industrializing, and that had severe costs, and people were fleeing. Fortunately, they could flee, fortunately for them, not the places they were going. They were able to flee to countries that were being ethnically cleansed, as we put it today. Their own indigenous populations were being wiped out and cleared so that the flow of immigrants from Europe couldn't take over. That's why we're here. That was kind of an escape valve for Europe during the period of rapid industrialization. And if you take a look at the figures, take a look at the United States, take a look at the rate of growth of population attributable to immigrants, it was highest before World War I. And that's fairly generally true. So by that measure, the highest level of globalization was before World War I. Notice that this is in accord with free trade theory, at least according to Adam Smith, for whom the cornerstone of free trade was what he called free distribution of labor. That means the ability of people to move around freely. If you don't have that, you can't seriously talk about free trade. Well, that's declined notably since, and nobody talks about it anymore. So in terms of integration of people, apparently the highest level of globalization was the first phase, pre-World War I. What about capital? Next measure, capital flow. Since the 1970s, in this second post-war phase, the globalization phase, capital flow, financial flows have expanded just astronomically. By now, it's reached the point that total global reserves, the reserves held by all countries, is approximately equal to about 1 day of foreign exchange turnover. International exchange, and that's overwhelmingly speculative, short term. Like about 80% of it goes up and back in less than a week, a lot of it in a couple hours or even minutes. It means it has nothing to do with the real economy. Foreign exchange trading by 1995, latest figures, is about 70 times as high as goods and service trading, real economy. You go back to, say, 1970, they were more or less on a par, not very different. Maybe foreign exchange trading was a little bit higher, but nothing like this. So that's hot money, it's just overwhelming the real economy. And that's a huge change, a radical change. There's been nothing like it in history, and that's quite different. That's a marked property of the second of the post-Bretton Woods phase, and it's the direct result of the liberalization of financial capital. First by Nixon and by others in the early 70s, and the breakdown of relatively fixed exchange rates. That's what the Bretton Woods system instituted back in 1944. Countries were supposed to be able to control capital flow, and exchange rates, how many yen you get for a dollar, was pretty much fixed. It remained remarkably stable over a long period. That's the system that was broken down by decision in the early 70s. That's the breakdown of the two phases, and one of the consequences is the effects on capital flow. Well, these two changes in free movement of people and free movement of capital They go in opposite directions with regard to globalization, but that tells you something about the way the international order has been designed, particularly in the last few decades, period of so-called globalization. It's been designed for capital, not for people, and particularly for financial capital. It's a dramatic feature of the globalization period, the last 10 or 20 years, 20, 30 years. And that's revealed has a lot of effects, shows up in all kinds of ways. So you compare profits and wages. Instantly, there's a lot of variation if you look from country to country. So these are kind of overall descriptions. But if you look at, but they're pretty stable. If you look at profits and wages, profits have gone way up. Wages have been either rising slowly or actually declining in many places, incidentally, including the United States. Inequality has gone way up. The usual line is that a rising tide, raises all boats, but that's not true. For one thing, the tide is rising more slowly than before, and many of the boats are working pretty hard to stay afloat, and working much harder than before just for that. You can see the differences if you take a look at things like, say, trade treaties versus human rights treaties. How does trade relate to human rights? Well, if you look at the treaties, they're quite different. The trade treaties have enforcement mechanisms. The trade treaties are imposed by the rich countries and backed by force. Legal requirements. You got to meet those requirements or else. The human rights treaties have no enforcement mechanisms. You want to live up to them, okay. You don't want to live up to them, nothing happens. There's no enforcement. Rich countries, like say the United States, don't pay much attention to them. In fact, even just signing conventions, the U.S. has an awful record, one of the worst in the world. You take a look at the major human rights conventions, the U.S. has ratified very few of them, and those few with all kind of reservations. Crucial here are things like labor rights conventions. The UN Development Report for the year 2000 just came out. One of the sections of it reviews ratification of International Labor Organization conventions, labor rights conventions. The U.S. ranks at the bottom, not in very nice company. It's along with Burma, Myanmar, and Equatorial Guinea, the only other two countries that have that rotten record of ratification. Now, of course, plenty of the countries that ratified conventions don't live up to them. That's another story. But ratification is at least some symbol of indication of how seriously they're taken. The U.S. labor record, putting aside conventions, is quite poor. Among the industrial countries, it's one of the poorest. It has a very violent labor history, unusual in the industrial world. The current situation, U.S. law does not conform to international labor conventions on many crucial issues, and even where the law is in place, it's just not enforced. This has gotten a lot worse in recent years. So you go back to, say, the 1950s, there were a couple hundred cases of workers who were illegally fired a year, fired for trying to organize. It's illegal, but it happens. And there were a few hundred cases looked at by the National Labor Relations Board. Last year, I think it was about over 20,000. It picked up very fast in the Reagan years. The Reaganites basically told the corporations, forget it, we're not going to enforce the law. And the number of illegal firings shot way up, I think approximately tripled, and it stayed about there since. And there are all kinds of devices by now to prevent the laws from being enforced. There's just a report by Human Rights Watch on this that just came out, but it's not the first. There have been others, including the business press, which has reported it fairly accurately. These are all aspects of the redesign of the international order for the benefit of capital, overwhelmingly financial capital, but not only, and against people who are less relevant in the system. Another measure that can be used is trade. So what's happened to trade during these various phases of globalization? Well, it turns out that pre-World War I, it was going up quite fast. It kind of leveled off or even declined between the wars, and then it's returned in the post-war period. It's been growing again. But rather strikingly, trade was growing faster during the Bretton Woods period than during the globalization period. So if you look at the first post-war phase, growth of trade was actually higher relative to the economy than it's been in the second phase, the globalization phase. That may sound odd, but it's not really. It's a reflection of something deeper, namely that the whole international economy its growth has declined in the second phase relative to the first phase. So exactly contrary to the standard picture, what I quoted before from this morning's Globe, that it's everywhere, the second phase, post-World War, has been worse by standard measures than the first phase. The second phase is the globalization phase. In fact, many economists now describe the first phase, Bretton Woods phase, as a golden age. Growth was high, wages were rising, benefits were increasing, and so on, up to early 70s, and they describe the second phase, it's called globalization, as the leaden age. Everything slowed down. And that's true across the board. So growth of the economy slowed. How much, it depends exactly what you measure, but there was a highly prestigious commission, the Bretton Woods Commission, headed by Paul Volcker, former head of the Federal Reserve. Can't get more respectable than that under Reagan. He was the head of it, so they came, this 50th anniversary of Bretton Woods, and their conclusion was that for the industrial countries, the rate of growth had declined by about half during the second phase, globalization phase. It's not that the economy's declined, it's the growth rate that declined. The UN UNCTAD, the UN monitoring of the economy, they just did a study on the poor countries, developing countries, and they reached a pretty similar conclusion that the growth rate had been cut by about half in the recent period. If you look at growth of capital investment, of productivity, trade, and so on, roughly the same story. It's declined during the second period. One thing that's increased is volatility. Markets are a lot more volatile, lots of crashes and bailouts and so on. If you take a look at, say, capital reserves that countries hold relative to exports, a capital reserve means something's not being used, so capital reserve relative to exports, that's increased very high, particularly for the poor countries. And the reason is they have to protect themselves from capital flight, from attacks on their currencies or capital flight. And that means they got a huge amount of reserves. In fact, about half the global reserves now are in the hands of the poor countries. They only account for about a quarter of the exports. They have to defend themselves against volatility and currency attacks. Interest rates have been far higher during the second period for essentially the same reason. Interest rates have to be kept high to prevent capital flight by speculators and so on. That's, again, slows growth. Well, that's fairly general. We can go on. Notice, just comment, that this is quite, it's not a matter of, the tide is rising wonderfully and some of the boats are being left behind. The tide is rising more slowly across the board, by just about every measure. These financial flows are overwhelmingly speculative. Maybe 2 or 3% of them have to do with the real economy as compared with, say, 90% 30 years ago. So they're unproductive. They're probably also harmful. Like, as I say, they keep interest rates high. But they have another effect, which has been pretty widely discussed. They undermine democracy for a simple reason. They create what some economists have called a virtual Senate. A Senate that's virtual in the usual sense. They don't meet, but they're there. And that virtual Senate of investment bankers and money managers and so on, they have a veto power over economic policy. It's what, like technical terms, is called a dual constituency conundrum. Parliaments have a dual constituency. On the one hand, there's the voters, the theoretical constituency. On the other hand, there's the speculators, the real constituency. And I'm quoting from a technical literature, they conduct moment-by-moment referendums on economic and financial policies. Like, they don't like them. They attack the currency, the capital flows out, and you stop doing them, or else you're in trouble, deep trouble. And that's a major attack on democracy. Right now, about half the world is technically in receivership, meaning their economic policies are actually made in Washington. And the rest are very heavily subject to the veto power of the virtual Senate. That's true even of the United States. I mean, when Clinton came in, there was some talk about stimulative policies this is not early 1993. But that's quickly stopped because the financial markets made it very clear they're not going to tolerate it. If that happens, there'll be an attack on the currency and the bonds and everything else. Interest rates will go up, the economy will go down. So they just backed off. And if maybe he would have anyway. But anyway, they did give up on the basis of that. And for poorer countries, it's just hopeless. Now, this didn't just happen. These were state decisions. The Bretton Woods system was designed to prevent this. The restriction back in the 40s, there was a tremendous popular commitment all over the world at the end of the anti-fascist war to a kind of radical democracy and social democracy and even more radical ideas, including the United States. And in response to that, the Bretton Woods system was created to permit what was called embedded liberalism, meaning free trade to the extent that you can have it, but carried out in such a way that allows governments to carry out their own social and economic policies, meaning high growth, full employment, social welfare, benefits, and so on, kind of what we call a welfare state. And it was understood that in order to have that, you have to have restrictions on capital flow. Because if capital flow moves freely, you're going to get just what's happened in the last 20 or 30 years, a virtual Senate with veto power. It was conscious, like you read Keynes and White and so on, they're very clear about it, as were others. Pretty predictably, they were shown to be correct. When the system broke down, was dismantled in the early 70s, you get, the effects you get are the kind of things I've described. Well, what about other effects? As I mentioned, the general macroeconomic effects, like the big figures, growth rates, productivity rates, and so on. The effects have generally been harmful, contrary to the standard story. What about other effects? So let's take the United States, the fairy tale economy that everyone else is supposed to mimic and so on. Well, the story's a lot more complex than that. For the rich, which I suppose includes maybe most of us, maybe all of us, certainly me, anybody in the top, overpaid college professors in the top few percentage of income, for them it's a fairy tale, no doubt. But let's take a look at, say, non-supervisory workers. That means people who make a wage and don't give orders. So most workers, in other words, like 75% of the workforce. For them, latest figures have just appeared, in fact. Average wages and average incomes are actually below the 1970s. That's in absolute terms. They've finally gotten back to 1989, peak of the last business cycle. On the other hand, median wages for male workers are actually down even since 1989 and lower than the 70s for almost everyone. If you take middle-income families, which really means working families, they are working, average middle-income families working about 6 weeks a year more than they did 10 years ago, just to keep afloat. Now that has all kinds of effects on families, on social life, on children, and so on, particularly in a country like ours, which has very weak support systems. Anybody who knows a working mother can tell you about that. The breakdown of the welfare system just exacerbates all those problems, not just for the welfare mothers, but for everybody at the low end of the income, of the wage level, because, it drags down everyone. These are not small effects. They're quite real. Household debt has reached unprecedented heights, partly driven by advertising-driven consumerism. People from infancy, kids have driven into their heads that the only thing in life is consume, more and more. And with incomes, stagnant or declining for most people, and enormous pressure to consume and to be an individualist and forget about everyone else, and so on and so forth, you get huge debt. Nobody knows what this means, but it's what its consequences will be, but it's historically completely unprecedented. There is a terrific thing, the stock market. Everyone knows the stock market has shot way up. You read the newspaper reports, they tell you the problem is to get other countries to adopt the American model where working people have stocks and therefore do great. That was a front page story in the New York Times the other day. The story is a little different. It's true that the stock market has gone out of sight, but it's also true that 1% of the population owns close to 50% of the stocks, 48% according to the latest figures, and 80% of the population, the bottom 80%, own 4%. Of course, that's scattered over a lot of people, and they don't have any control of it, because what it is maybe in a pension fund or something. So yes, the stock market is doing great, but it's benefiting a very small proportion of the population. I mean, it happens to be the same part of the population that's writing the articles about the fairy tale economy. Maybe a significant correlation, or maybe it isn't, but anyway, it's a correlation. What about poverty? Well, poverty in the United States is worse than it was in 1979. The U.S. and Britain, which are the two countries that were most extreme with the reforms, Reagan and Thatcher, they're the worst in the industrial world by quite a large margin. In Britain, UK, poverty has approximately doubled since the early 80s, since the Thatcher period. Child poverty in the United States is far higher than 1979. In the industrial world, again, the United States and Britain are the worst in child poverty. In Britain, child poverty has tripled since 1990, and it was going up through the 80s.